Good afternoon, everybody. Good to see you. I am here on the traditional territory of Lekwungen-speaking people, the Songhees Nisquamish First Nation, and I want to just brief British Columbians on some changes that will take place as we go into the long weekend here in British Columbia and, of course, across Canada and indeed around the world, where we have faith-based organizations celebrating Passover, celebrating Easter. Ramadan's about to begin. Vaisakhi is just around the corner. Bonnie Henry and I and Adrian Dix spoke with 130 faith leaders yesterday to talk to them about how best to deal with this time when many faith groups are coming together. It's also a time, I think, when people look towards the outdoors. It's going to be a spectacularly wonderful weekend weather-wise, and all the more reason for us to take stock of where we are with our fight against the COVID-19 virus, and to reassert the importance of us staying the course and abiding by the directions that Dr. Henry has been giving for the past number of weeks. One of the issues that I wanted to talk about specifically is the return of snowbirds and the arrival of repatriation flights of Canadians who have been for the past number of weeks in other countries, other jurisdictions where COVID-19 regulations may not be as stringent as they are here. And although we welcome home all of those travelers, we also are asking them to join with all of us in the battle that we've been waging together over the past number of weeks. We've been staying home. We've been giving up some of our liberties in the interest of the benefit to the greater good. And as people return to British Columbia, we have an expectation that they will follow suit. So when people arrive at the Vancouver International Airport, they will be required to have a self-isolation plan. Now, this self-isolation plan is not just a suggestion, it is a directive from the Public Health Office. It also is consistent with the Quarantine Act that has been put in place by the federal government, and it is mandatory for those coming back to British Columbia to have a plan. And we're going to be taking steps with the federal government to ensure that travelers coming back to Canada, whether they be at land crossings, whether they be at Vancouver International Airport, that they will be met by BC officials, they'll be met by federal officials, and they will be required to explain in detail with forms that will be provided on flight, forms that are also available on the web, to ensure that these legal documents are completed upon arrival and that a plan has been put in place. I believe this is a reasonable expectation, as you know, all of you who are listening and all of those across British Columbia who are working very hard to bend the curve. We have an expectation that those that have been away, as grateful as they are, I'm sure, to be back in British Columbia, they have to pick up the ball and carry it just as we all have. That plan must be approved by BC officials, and if there is not a self-isolation plan, a quarantine site will be prepared and made available to those individuals until they can get themselves together. This has been a plan that has been agreed to by the federal government. They will be joining us next week comprehensively. But they're not quite ready yet, and I don't make that as a criticism. I just say that we are ready to go. We have been for some time. We have more resources on the ground in British Columbia, obviously, than the federal government does. I've spoken regularly with Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, as well as with the Prime Minister and other premiers across the country, and we need to make sure that all of the work that Canadians have been doing is not erased by a group of people who may come back and not have the same level of perseverance that British Columbians have had to this point in time. I want to reinforce that in order for all of us to stay safe, in order for us to protect those frontline workers, those healthcare workers that are putting their lives on the line to protect British Columbians, we need to flatten the curve. We need to listen to the directives that we have received daily for weeks and weeks from Dr. Henry and Minister Dix, that we need to ensure that we're self-isolating if we're coming back from a jurisdiction that has COVID-19 in place and could be a risk to fellow citizens. So with that, I'm happy to answer any questions you may have. And I also advise that I have made an exemption. I think some of you have picked this up, an exemption to the essential service list I've added the Easter Bunny, so there is no fear. I've got a couple of letters from youngsters concerned that Easter could be disrupted by COVID-19. I have also a list of suggestions for the Easter Bunny about washing paws, about ensuring that there is some safe physical distancing when eggs are being distributed around British Columbia. But Easter Bunny will be here on the weekend, kids. You can rest easy with that. And I'll ask Jen for some questions.
A reminder to media on the line, press *1 to get in the queue, and please unmute your mics. Or your phones. You will not be audible until we call on you. Our first question is from Lisa Yusta.
I'm going to go off topic for a second here. Wondering about the $500 rent rebate and the $1,000 one-time tax-free payment. People are asking, are these going to be bumped up because they just don't feel like enough, even with all the other measures that are being taken?
Well, first of all, we have not yet been able to deploy the renter's rebate, the renter's credit, until we had in place a federal program that launched this week to, I think, fairly positive reviews. In order to access either of the two programs that you identified, the rent supplement as well as the $1,000, you need to have demonstrated to the federal program that you are able to apply through that process. Once you have that receipt or that certification, you then bring it to provincial officials and the dollars will flow. I think it's premature to suggest that we need to up the ante. We said from the beginning that the $5 billion that we put aside to address the challenges that people will be facing in the days and weeks ahead, we said that was the beginning, not the end. But we've just now seen the federal dollars flow. It's the first week of April, and I know people are struggling. I understand that, but we need to have a baseline and a starting point, and we've just arrived at that starting point. Once we see the results of the first week or so of effort to get dollars into people's pockets, we'll be in a better position to assess where we go from here.
Next up, we have Vaughn Palmer.
Premier, Adrian Dix flagged this problem a week ago today, and a significant number of flights have already come back. Are you concerned that people may have already come into the country without a plan, not self-isolated, and the problem may already be here?
I can't answer that question directly, Vaughn, but I can say that there was, for example, a repatriation flight that arrived last weekend. I sent one of my colleagues, Parliamentary Secretary Ravi Kahlon, who will be coordinating volunteers to make sure that we have translation services at the airport. YBR has been very good. I've spoken with the CEO there and his team. We need to make sure we're providing as seamless a transition for those who are returning, whether they're coming from Arizona or Florida or from other parts of the world, that they have the tools they need to achieve the objectives that we want to see. We have been raising this with the federal government for some time, and I don't want to characterize this as a criticism, Vaughn, because we are all making this up as we go. And we identified this as a problem early on. I'm pleased that tomorrow will be the last day for flights originating in the U.S. to arrive in either Victoria or Kelowna. And the only destination now for inbound passengers outside of Canada will be YBR. So our ability to manage that has greatly improved. Similarly, I want to make sure that on land crossings, this weekend we'll have 4 of the 8 land crossings staffed by BC officials to work with Border Service Agency people to ensure that we're making this as seamless as possible. We're not assuming first and foremost people are going to be bad actors. We want to make sure that we can help them be good actors by giving them the tools that they will need and acknowledging to them that coming back to Canada and then stopping at the golf course to hit a bucket of balls and maybe going to pick up some groceries and stopping at a buddy's place is not self-isolation. So some of these things seem self-evident to those of us who have been doing this for the past number of weeks, but it's not necessarily self-evident to those who are arriving back into Canada. Grateful to be back here, to be sure. We want to make sure they have all the tools they need to make sure that our success is not diminished.
Next up, we have Rob Buffum.
Well, hi, Premier. I'm wondering about enforcement of this new policy. If somebody sees somebody violating these things or has concerns, who should they turn to for enforcement? Would that be the police empowered? Would that be a bylaw officer? How does that work?
Well, we certainly want to. We've been working through Minister Farnworth and public safety officials to empower bylaw officers and others, and that's a work in progress as well, Rob. This all is a work in progress. But our expectation is if citizens see other fellow citizens acting badly, if they know they've come back from abroad and are not self-isolating, you want to approach them and encourage them to get back into their house or back into their place of isolation. And if that's unsuccessful, I think you should contact authorities, whether it be the public health office where these directives originated, or local law enforcement.
Next question, Samir Kaushal.
Hi, Premier. Thank you so much for the time. I just have the thousands of Canadians coming back in the coming weeks. So what message do you have for them and for their local families? And do we have any hotline number where people can contact to raise any concern, or if someone is not abiding by law, where they can complain directly?
There will be a website. There is a website that goes live today. I regrettably don't have that in front of me, but we'll get Dr. Henry and Adrian will perhaps have that at their briefing later today. What we're saying to people coming back to Canada is welcome. It's good to see you again. This is what we've been doing while you were away. We've been working as a province collectively to bend the curve on the COVID-19 virus, and we have demonstrable evidence that we have been making progress. We are far from out of the woods. Dr. Henry's been very clear on that. But we have made progress, particularly measured against other provinces across the country. I've been engaged for weeks now in discussions with fellow premiers, with federal officials. My colleagues in cabinet have been talking to their opposite numbers as we try to craft a pan-Canadian approach to this challenge. And every time we run into an obstacle, we look at problem solving. Chrystia Freeland and I are in regular contact several times a day. I find a problem, I work with my ministers, we present it to the federal government, and we work together to find that solution. And I think those coming back who have been away for a period of time need to celebrate with us the success that we've seen, but they need to then join with us to continue going through these next number of weeks that are so critically important to our success. There will be materials available. They will be available prior to getting on the flight. If anyone has traveled internationally, you'll know that Immigration Canada and Customs give you a form to fill out before you can leave the airport. This is not unlike that situation. We want everyone to tell us what their plan is. We'll be monitoring that, and I've asked Parliamentary Secretary Ravi Kahlon to work, as he was formerly the Parliamentary Secretary for Multiculturalism. We want to make sure we have translation services at the airport. This is not something that the airport traditionally does, but this is what good neighbors do. We want to make sure that those who may be challenged by English as a first language, or English as a second language rather, that they're not intimidated by the forms to the point that they don't fill them out correctly. This is really important that everybody understand this is not optional. This is not a suggestion. These are part of the directives that Dr. Henry's been putting in place from the Public Health Office, as well as the Quarantine Act, which is supervised.
/returning travelers.
gov.bc.ca/returning travelers. Thank you.
And our next question comes from Ian Bailey.
Premier, you say, by the way, you'll be monitoring that. How will you be monitoring that? And also, just hearing something else, are you prepared to consider the request by the Regional District of East Kootenay to close the border with Alberta to non-essential travel? Do you see the inter-provincial travel as an issue worth addressing and dealing with this pandemic?
Well, let me start in the north first, Ian, and I'll come back to the east. I've had the conversations yesterday with Premier Sandy Silver from Yukon. Yukon is very concerned. They have a very few number of cases there. They don't have the capacity in their acute care system to manage much more than that. We have a reciprocal arrangement where if there's need, we will get citizens from the Yukon to health facilities in British Columbia. But there are communities like Atlan, for example, Lower Post, communities in British Columbia that get most of their services, their groceries and other amenities and basic needs from Yukon. So Sandy Silver, the Premier there, fully understands that. Atland often, you can get a t-shirt in Atland that says, welcome to Atland, Yukon, or welcome to Atland, BC, depending on how you feel that day. And I think it's that cross-border relationship that's really important to Canadians, to be in place, but also have the ability to move to other places. It is, of course, important at this difficult time that people understand and recognize that self-isolation does not mean getting into the Winnebago and heading for a vacation in British Columbia. I know Minister Dix and Dr. Henry will be talking about this later in the day. They're in contact with the Alberta Minister of Health. Jason Kenney and I have talked about these issues. The health ministers are going to be dealing with that later in the day, but I believe that everyone understands that this is not, I mean, we're so close. We've done so much and so many people have sacrificed. We don't want to let that slide away because a handful of people decide that it's okay for them to bend the rules rather than to bend the curve.
Next up, we have Tanya Fletcher.
Premier, apologies, this is a bit of a 4-for-1 question, but you referenced the quarantine sites. Wondering if there are more details, how many, where they'll be, what they'll look like. Also, how many returning passengers are we expecting? And finally, how should people expect to get home from the airport?
Well, that's what we're working on to ensure that we have volunteers that are ready. That's what Parliamentary Secretary Callon is working on right now, to find ways that we can get people from the airport. If you're symptomatic, you're not going to be leaving the airport. This is purely for people who come back, they have no symptoms, they feel fine. We still need to have the isolation plan. So if you have the plan, you're directed to get to that place where you're going to isolate. With respect to quarantine sites, that's not information that I have available to me, but that again is something in consultation with the federal government we're working on to ensure that if you don't have a plan, we have a place for you to go till you figure it out. And if you don't have it figured out, you'll stay there for 14 days.
Next, we have Penny Daflos.
Oh, hi there. Thanks very much for taking my question. I'm just wondering, what kind of monitoring are you looking at? I know South Korea has an app to monitor where people are when they return, and I'm just wondering if that's something that you're looking at, just because it could be quite labor intensive to try to call people all the time just to find out where they are. I'm just wondering in terms of being able to have that ongoing monitoring.
Well, we certainly can access apps and location detectors on telephones. We're going to be doing this on a personal basis to start with, as we start developing this program over the next week to 10 days. With the federal government, we'll have more information on how that management will take place. I felt it was important to get out of the gate now. There's going to be a repatriation flight later in the week. The borders, of course, are going to be seeing an increased amount of traffic coming back from the United States as snowbirds start to make their way back to British Columbia. And so we wanted to make sure that the public knew today that there is going to be a requirement of a plan, and they should start contemplating that. The details are going to be worked out as the federal government gets to a place where they can join us. And again, I want to reiterate, they are on the same page as we are. Well, I shouldn't say that. We're in the same book. They're a page or two behind us, but I'm not bothered by that, nor are they. It's just easier for us to implement because we're on the ground. We're British Columbians. Ottawa needs to redeploy resources across the country. The success we have here will hopefully be duplicated in Toronto and Montreal. That's the plan, as Minister Freeland has laid out to me. And again, I'll leave it to them to deal with those issues, but I don't want anyone to come away from this assuming that I'm not satisfied with the level of cooperation, because I am quite satisfied. We needed to make it abundantly clear that this was a challenge. Health officials shared that challenge. The people in Ottawa get it, and we're working on a solution.
Next up is Mary Griffin.
The flights coming in to Victoria and Kelowna. There's a flight that arrived just an hour ago from Seattle to Victoria, and I know the flights are ending tomorrow. But these regulations came into effect weeks ago to make the 4 hubs for international air traffic. And I'm wondering why these flights have continued for so long after the original directive, and what measures have been taken to ensure that these people are being screened who are coming through, because Washington State apparently is not going to reach their peak of cases for some days yet. Yeah,
that's a very good question, and that's one of the reasons that we raised this so aggressively with the federal government. We were assuming that YBR was the only destination for inbound traffic. And of course, because of the seamless relationship we have with the United States, I believe officials assumed that flights from the US were not international flights. Of course they are. And again, I'm not pointing any fingers here, but it was important to us that there be a solution to this problem. It includes our major airports in Kelowna and in Victoria. They will no longer be receiving flights from the US. That leaves just YBR, where there's a greater capacity and a better opportunity for officials from the federal and provincial government to work together in cooperation to ensure that the self-monitoring or self-isolation plans are in place. Prior to today, returning Canadians were required to self-isolate. That was part of the Public Health Directive. That was part of the Quarantine Act initiative announced by the Prime Minister. So all we're changing here is that we're going to ask for a specific plan. It can't be, oh, I'm going to do this, I'm going to do that. It needs to be in writing. The forms are straightforward. People will be there to assist those who have language difficulties. And from this point forward, there's an expectation of a written plan, and I expect everyone to abide by that.
Next, we have Jordan Armstrong.
Hi, Premier. Thanks for your time. A question about Vancouver's downtown Eastside. The sidewalks there are just packed with people today. Oppenheimer Park is still full of tents. And the mayor of Vancouver essentially says the city has done all it can. Now it's up to BC Housing, he says. I know normally you can't just force people into shelter or a hotel room, but can you do that now? Are you considering doing that now, given this is a public health emergency and physical distancing is impossible to achieve in that location?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question. And we have been working with the City of Vancouver, BC Housing, as well as public health officials. This is a grave concern. We need to work cooperatively to get a solution there. It is not always an easy answer. This has been a challenge in the downtown east side for decades. It is critically important now that we ensure that when we can, we assist people getting out of their current situation and into safe housing, and we can manage their other issues, whether they be mental health or addiction issues, to protect them and to protect other British Columbians. Dr. Henry is seized of these issues. I've been working with a collection of ministers within my government, social development, the housing minister, of course, as well as the advanced education minister who represents the area, Melanie Mark. And we have been working with peer groups. We've been working with the City of Vancouver. We have a three-pronged approach, starting with cleaning in single occupancy rooms, starting with ensuring that there's access to food, which with restaurants closing down, the challenges of getting food into the downtown east side is acute. And then enabling peer helpers who are often critical to helping people understand the situation that they're in and help them find a way to isolate for periods of time in the day, if not permanently. And so these are big challenges. We're working on them, and we're working cooperatively with the City of Vancouver. But this is a frustrating issue that's been frustrating for many decades. And it's now critically important to the broader public health that we address it directly. Dr. Henry has the ability to look at these issues. We've already looked at prescription supplies of whatever is required for those who have addiction issues. This is a big step that the federal government, the province, and the City of Vancouver have been working on for some time, and now we're into that. So we've got opportunity to make some progress here, and we're committed to making sure we do that.
Next is Shrishti Basu.
Hi, Premier. I was just wondering, for people traveling from YBR to Vancouver Island, if they're planning to take BC ferries, how is the government, if at all, planning to monitor isolation on the ferries and traveling to the island from the mainland?
Well, Transport Canada has brought in new regulations requiring that people disclose their health condition before they get on a ferry. And that, of course, started last week. We used that as an example of the federal government deciding that this was a policy that they could bring forward. They did bring it forward. I worked with Transport Canada, my colleague Claire Trevena as well, to make sure that people could stay in their vehicles on the car deck. And so if you're traveling by vehicle, if you come at a border crossing and go straight to the ferry, get on the ferry, and then go home, you're golden. The challenge, of course, is monitoring and making sure that people go home. And we're hoping and expecting fellow citizens to understand and recognize the sacrifices that we've been making here in BC over the past month and a half, and that they are going to fall into line and carry on that good work that all the rest of us have been doing.
Next, we have Rob Monroe.
Yes, Premier. Just wondering, if these people are coming back from and landing in Vancouver, do they get connecting flights to Kelowna and have to self-isolate here, or do they get have to stay in Vancouver and self-isolate there for that 14 days?
If there are British Columbians returning to YVR that are going to another destination, if they have no symptoms, if they are approved by health officials that will be at YVR to carry on to a connecting flight within British Columbia, that I assume will be taking place. Similarly, if you're traveling to Vancouver Island, getting from the airport to the ferry terminal and back to your home needs to be part of your self-isolation plan. And again, most British Columbians, I assume, who are coming back from extended periods of time traveling abroad have the resources and wherewithal to make that happen. If they don't, that's where the Quarantine Act and public health directives will take precedent, and a quarantined area will be provided for those individuals.
And finally, we have Richard Sisman.
Premier, I have two questions for you, and they're separate, so just to keep them in track here. The first is on, you've unrolled a number of benefit plans, whether there will be any specifically for those who have had loved ones die due to COVID-19. This will specifically be part of a story. I'm sure you've seen the details about the 40-year-old, the man in his 40s who recently died, and whether his wife will receive any additional supports if she can't continue working. And secondly, we've seen a lot today on property taxes and some measures being taken by the Mayor of Port Coquitlam. Is the province going to step in and help municipalities financially to cover potential costs associated with the loss of COVID-19 and to ensure that there aren't property tax increases, or they could potentially defer those property taxes? Sorry for the long questions.
Well, let me start with the tragic loss of life and the world. It's a very sad time for that family, but it's also a time for us to all step up and do what we can to help. When it comes to the challenges around revenues to municipalities, which is primarily from property taxes, whether they be from businesses or individuals, property tax time isn't until July. They're not due until July. If someone's on a quarterly payment system, of course, that'd have a different sentiment to that statement. But what we're trying to do, and again, Minister Robinson, responsible for municipal relationships between the province and municipalities, as well as Minister James, are working as close as they can with the Union of BC Municipalities and individual municipalities, in the case of Vancouver, which has its own charter, to make sure that we're doing what we can to protect those businesses and families that are in a pinch right now, because they've had an impact on their revenues and on their ability to pay their bills. But we haven't got a plan in place today, but it's obviously front and center, not just on the individuals who owe the taxes, but to those municipalities that depend on those taxes to provide the services that we all come to expect. This is a double whammy, and we need to look at it that way. People need to understand that when they forego their taxes, they're going to be foregoing services as well, unless we can find some way to fill those gaps. And that means having a good hard look at all we're doing at all orders of government, federal, provincial, and municipal, to make sure that we have in place coherent policies to not overlap, but to complement each other. And that's what our objective has been from the beginning. So far, so good. There's obviously improvements that can be made. And as issues come forward, we're going to try and address them systematically. This one is, we discussed it just this morning in Cabinet. Minister Robinson and Mr. James are all over it, and we'll have more to say in the days ahead. But again, people need to understand, if you pull from this pocket, you're going to have to put something else out there or take something else away. That's regrettably the game we're in right now, but we need to do it together and be thoughtful about how we steward public resources, whether they're federal, provincial, or municipal.
Thank you, everyone.
Great. Happy Easter, happy Vaisakhi, happy Passover, happy Ramadan.